elaborate on the four ways of knowing?
Every one of these kinds of knowing has a particular vehicle, a particular result, a particular standard, and a particular kind of memory. This is a rigorous taxonomy. And in the scientific taxonomy, you want it to be very systematic and rigorous. So the kind of knowing we're most familiar with and our culture is very fixated on is propositional knowing. This is knowing that something is the case. This is knowing that cats are mammals. The standard of realness for that is truth. You're convinced that something is true, and it results in beliefs. You get true beliefs, and perhaps they become true justified beliefs, etc. And the kind of memory that's associated with that is called semantic memory. So, for example, if I ask you, do you remember learning that cats are mammals? Can you tell me the day that really dropped for you? And you go, I don't know, right? That's semantic memory. And the reason why I'm saying this is all of these memories are distinct from each other, such that like it's possible to damage one without the others being completely damaged. So the next is procedural knowing. This is knowing how. This is knowing how to kiss someone. This is knowing how to kick a ball. This is knowing how to swim. This doesn't result in beliefs. This results in skills. And skills aren't true or false. Tim, do you know how to swim?
I do.
Right. Now, is swimming true or false right now? No, you're misunderstanding. Skills aren't true or false. They apply or they don't, and they apply powerfully or they don't. And so its standard of realness is powered. Does our know-how empower us? Prosaically enough, psychologists call the form of memory associated with this procedural memory. I'm going in an order of dependence. The propositional depends on the procedural, and we can get into that in a minute, but I'll just go through the four first. The next is perspectival knowing. This is knowing what it's like to be. So you know what it's like to be you now in your state of mind in this situation. You know what you're foregrounding, you know what you're backgrounding, you know what is salient for you. You can sense how the salience is shifting around. You got a sense of how you're fitted to this situation. This doesn't result in skills or beliefs, it results in perspectives. And you know how to take perspectives, and you know what the difference between perspectives are, and how valuable it is to have multi-perspectives on a situation. Sometimes in order to solve a problem, you shift to a different perspective. Perspectives aren't true or false. They're not powerful or not. Their standard of realness is presence. How present are you in the situation? And this has its own kind of memory called episodic memory. So I can ask you perhaps, do you remember what you did on your last birthday? You'll remember a particular perspective you had on a particular situation and your state of mind in that situation. That's your episodic memory. Now, below that is participatory knowing. This is knowing by being. This is the kind of knowing that results from how you and reality have been co-shaped to fit together to generate those affordances. So, for example, the water bottle and I have both been shaped by gravity. We've both been shaped by electromagnetism so that there's an affordance there. We've both been shaped by a biological history, which is niche construction. My ancestors evolved, they made tools that shaped the environment that shaped my ancestors. And culture has shaped me in this, technology made this, and taught me how to drink out of a water bottle. So there's been all this co-shaping of me and parts of the environment, so we fit together, we're niche together, we belong together, affordances are available to me. That's carried in this very weird sense of memory that you probably don't even recognize. It's your sense of self, the sense of all of the identities you've taken up and how they're somehow historically, narratively linked together to certain narrative histories of certain situations. So here's the proposal. You have participatory knowing, it's laying out affordances. And when that's missing, you know it. Culture shock, or when you're homesick, or when you're lonely.
Could you just define affordances?
Yeah, affordances are like the graspability. The affordances are real relations for how you can interact with the object, how that object is available to you. So this affords graspability. The water bottle is graspable. That's an affordance, a real relation of fittedness. So me and the water bottle belong together. It makes itself available for certain interactions, and I can shape myself to interact with it powerfully and appropriately.
Could you perhaps give an example of an affordance that would come into play with culture shock?
So an affordance would come into play with culture shock. There are certain affordances about how you and other people relate that tell you when conversation is available to you, when there's an affordance for conversation. And notice that most of this is unconscious for you. Notice even within your own culture. So Tim, how close should you stand to somebody at a funeral?
You know, I was just thinking about the body spacing because I was just in Japan where it's very, very different. I couldn't give you a discrete number, but there's probably a feeling associated with it where it goes from comfortable to uncomfortable.
Right. And you've got that sense of, and it wasn't working in Japan, right? And
Very
so that way of connecting to people by shaping the literal personal space between you and them was not available to you. That affordance wasn't there. So the affordances are here. And then the perspectival knowing makes certain affordances salient to me, grabbing my attention, arousing my metabolism. The floor is walkable for me right now, but I don't need to walk right now. So it's not something that I'm paying attention to, right?
Yeah.
But I bring it into my situational awareness with the perspectival knowing. That situational awareness tells me which skills I should activate, which procedural knowing. And then the procedural knowing puts me into the causal relationships with the world that give me the evidence for my beliefs. So that's all the kinds of knowing. And the point is, outside of the propositional, these other kinds of knowing are built on the way you are coupled to the environment, dynamically coupled to the environment. And therefore, they hearken back to that participation, that contact we were talking about.
Is there some interplay between what people experience as flow states and the activation or use of multiple forms of knowing?
I think the flow state is an example of, in our experience, a prioritization of the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory over the propositional. In fact, one of the things people reliably report is that whole propositional processing drops out. How am I doing? How do I look? Do people like me?
Yeah.
How am I doing? Maybe I should lose some weight. How am I doing? How's my hair? Right? That all falls away. There's this enlivening, enriching of a sense of contact. One of the defining features of the flow state is people feel at one with their environment. They feel dynamically coupled to it. They feel like, so that's participatory. They feel at one with it. And the perspectival, everything is super salient. There's an ongoing sense of discovery, of even like almost like insight. And well, I've argued it's an insight cascade. And you're getting even more, you're getting super present. And then, of course, the procedurality is you just know how to do it. And it just flows, hence the word, it just flows from you. And what's really important is that, the flow state is optimal for people. They think they're at their best, and they'll say it's one of the best experiences they had, one of the most rewarding, even more rewarding than pleasure. So much so that asking people how frequently they get into the flow state is a good predictor of their sense of well-being. This is a clear example of that non-propositional connectedness. Flow is about really realizing the transjectivity, the connectedness, and how much it contributes to a sense of agency and meaning for people. And this is a question, this has become a question to me. What are the contexts that generate flow that transfers powerfully versus the context where the flow stays locked into that particular context?
That is a great question. That is such a good question.
One of the things I think has to do with whether or not the skill or the skill set that's being trained in the particular practice is relatively indispensable in domains other than the situation you're in. Now, ideas about sensory motor movement and balance and coordination and getting the cerebellum and the frontal cortex to talk better to each other, that transfers broadly. We've already got a lot of information, like evidence about that, especially the cerebellum cortex loop. That, like, even when people are meditating, the cerebellum is firing like crazy because of the cerebellum cortex loop. And so if it does that, it even shows up in the metaphors. We talk about balancing equations and justice being the balancing of things and scales. And so, like, you want to find a set of skills that has that inbuilt potential. And then what I would want to say is the degree to which there has been a framework built around the situation, a ritual philosophical framework that helps to afford the translation. So around the Tai Chi Chuan, you have Taoism, which gives you this way of framing reality as yin and yang that you can see instantiated in the Tai Chi, but you can also see it prevalent in the world. You set up the possibility with this framework for the resonance. And so people who get trapped, the ones that suffer from video game addiction, they get the problem that they flow in a world that does not have a framework around it, does not tap into those generally transferable skills. And so they find the external world depressing because of its absence of flow potential. That drives them into the game where they flow, and then you get the vicious cycle that gets you into the addiction. So I think there's something about, are the kinds of skills that are being brought into the flow state, do they have this domain general power? And is there a framework around it that helps people set up these patterns of resonance between what they're doing in the practice and how they're seeing the world and encountering it?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. If there is some overarching philosophical framework or religious framework for that matter, within which you're practicing a given skill, there's a broader context that then extends whatever you're honing in this specific situation to other domains. And it makes me think actually of a friend of mine. His name is Josh Waitzkin. He is able to take concepts from all these different disciplines and apply them in transfers to all of these other things. So for instance, in chess, he talks a lot about practicing the macro in the micro, or learning the macro from the micro. So he'll say, chess people, often novices will say practice openings, but that's kind of like copying from the teacher's answer book. You're memorizing a lot in terms of declarative knowledge, but you're not learning principles. So he'll say, why don't you start with, let's just say 3 or 4 or 5 pieces on the board, and you're going to practice manipulating empty space or pulling into a vacuum. Lo and behold, a lot of those same principles transferred over to Tai Chi. And then he took principles from Tai Chi and moved them over into foil boarding. Is Tai Chi your go-to break glass in case of emergency tool in the department of flow states, or do you have other approaches in the quiver?
Yeah, I have learned how to get into the flow state when lecturing. That inevitably affords really good learning. Of course, not for every student. That would be claimed something that's impossible. No teacher is a great teacher to every student. But very often students get drawn into it because I encourage a lot of sort of Socratic dialogue in the lecture. And so it very much often becomes a shared flow state. I become very interested in shared flow states and what they mean for how we can unpack sort of the capacity for insight and reflection. So that's one of my other go-to areas.
So in lecturing, did you do that naturally from the outset, or was that a learned skill? If so, how did you develop that?
So very much a cultivated thing, and deliberately so. By nature, I'm almost pathologically shy. You cultivate your character to compensate for your personality defects. I've read my report cards from grade 3, and they were calling me mini teacher. So taking on the role of the teacher, that was how I started to manage that situation.
Manage a situation, you mean manage your shyness by assuming the role of teacher.
Yes, right. The full sort of persona and the role. So Tim, if like this is close enough to teaching, and I don't mean to put you in the role of a student, I'm not saying that, but it's close enough, it's in proximity for transfer.
Oh, I'm a student.
Yep. Well, anyways, it's comfortable. But I mean, if you were to meet me like at a social party, I'm at times indistinguishable from potted plants, right? Because when I don't have that role available to me, my sort of natural constitution comes out. So it was very deliberately cultivated from very, very early on. And then as I started doing Tai Chi Chuan, when I started in grad school hearing about the bleed, that's when I started to teach and lecture. And I looked for it, and I looked for what broke it and what enhanced it. And I slowly cultivated it more and more over time. Yes, it was very much a deliberate, long-term cultivation.
What enhances it? Because you take Harvard Business School, they have these case study methods, and there is ostensibly supposed to be a fair amount of interplay between lecturer and student. But I would imagine not all professors would say they achieve a flow state, even if they've experienced it in other places like surfing. So what have you found to be things that enhance that for yourself and for the students?
Part of this, I'm going to declare a bias because I have a published theory about what I think the flow state is. I think it's an insight cascade and the enhancement of implicit learning. So we cultivate better insight capacities, we cultivate better intuition in an integrated manner. What I mean by that is more and more I crafted giving priority to the emergence of insight or intuition in me as I was lecturing, not sticking to the script so strongly, but willing to bend. So I use the jazz analogy. I may have the script of the lecture, but I can riff on it, and I look and I hunger and sensitize myself for that. And then when the students start to even demonstrate sort of proto-insight, I will I will really call that out. I mean, in a positive manner, and draw it out, and they get right, and then they start priming each other with insights, and they start priming me, and I start priming them. And so it's an easy thing to state, and it's a hard thing to do, because when you're lecturing, and when I teach people how to lecture, I actually try to get them to make space for the jazz, because what you do when you're anxious, and one of the things that really kills it a lot is PowerPoint, right? Because what you want is, I need to say all of these things, and I need to be clear, and I need to have everything follow. And so you get really, like, you try to constrain your anxiety with the tightness of this structure that you built.
Yep.
And what that actually does is that undermines the possibility of flow. It's like Tai Chi Chuan. You want to be Peng. You don't want to be too yin, too yang. You got to loosen the structure enough so that insight and intuition flow, but not so much that the lecture becomes incoherent. And you find the sweet spot.